Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Starlit Library. I am Mars, and today I'm going to be doing a quarterly wrap up. So, I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in January, February, and March. January and February were very chaotic months for me. I was working on my thesis for the most part, and then plans changed, and my life kind of got derailed a little bit in the end of February. March was a bit more chill for me, but needless to say, things did not go as planned. With being so busy, I didn't get to read very much, which is fine. I was taking things very easy. So, starting off with January, I read 3 books. So, the first book I finished was Mistress of Lies by K.M. Enright. And this is a fantasy talking about blood magic and a spy that wants to get revenge on the king and become the head of her household, as well as following a different perspective of an orphan with special powers of kind of being able to alter the will of other people. And these two characters come together, and this is kind of like a vampire story, but not really. Like, it's not very like explicit and evident. I kind of forgot that this was supposed to be kind of like about vampires. But anyways, this also centers around a romance that develops between these two characters, as well as a third character. So it is like a love triangle slash turns into a throuple. And so that part was really interesting. I really liked the representation and the queer normativity. And the author and one of the characters is trans, and it has a lot of influence of their Filipino background, which was really interesting, really nice to see this sort of mix of cultures and queer normativity and how that played into the story. I found this to be a pretty compulsive read. I got through this very quickly, and I kept on wanting to come back and figure out what was happening, because basically they are trying to figure out who is killing people, because there are dead bodies that keep on showing up throughout the town, and they are trying to investigate who is killing these people. And I found it compulsive, but I think that the attraction between the characters was too fast. There really wasn't a slow burn. It was kind of like not quite instant, but like much faster than I would have preferred. And as much as I did enjoy this, I think it kind of fell off a bit towards the end, where I was confused. Things seemed a bit illogical. I didn't fully understand the motives of some of the characters or what exactly they were planning to do. And so I'll definitely have to like revisit this before the next one comes out, but this just came out last year. And so the ending kind of threw me off a bit. I don't know, and I was like trying to pay attention and tie the threads together, but something just didn't really click for me, or I just felt kind of confused at the end and the resolution. But other than that, I did enjoy this. I gave it like a 3.5 or 3.75 stars. The next book I finished in January was Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki, and this I've been interested in for a while. It follows a violin teacher who made a deal with the devil and a transgender girl who is a violin prodigy, and a alien who comes to Earth and opens up a donut shop because she's on the run from her empire. Really love the representation in this, but this is set in real world in California, and so we do see a lot of real world implications of these people's lives, and especially transphobia. And I was kind of surprised that this went into very dark topics, and it talked a lot about the dark experiences that the main character Katrina had, the trans girl, and how she was trying to navigate through life, all of the transphobia she faced, all of the things that she had to do for survival, because she basically ran away from her parents and she had to do sex work in order to get some money. And so it really dives into those deep topics. So I would look up trigger warnings because there are some dark things that it mentions, but at the end of the day, this is a hopeful story, and it talks about her rise of the passion that she finds through violin, And I found it very sweet because I used to play the violin when I was younger, and so this taught me a lot more about. It mentioned, some technical terms about the music, and so it made me really miss the violin and really want to pick it back up again. There was also a romance that was budding between the alien and the violin teacher, and so I thought that was really cute. So I really enjoyed this, and I liked the messages and the writing, and how at the end of the day this was had a very hopeful tone to it and a sort of a found family theme. In the end, I gave this a 3.5 stars. The last book that I finished in January was Your Inner Fish, a journey into the 3.5 billion year history of the human body. This is a nonfiction I picked up at a library sale, and this was super fun. I've been reading so much nonfiction already this year, and so I love that. And I love that I actually got through a physical book because I usually get through them through audio. I find it much easier, but this was very easy, and I also love all the pictures and diagrams it has, and how this is a topic that I'm already pretty familiar with, and so I already knew quite a lot. Not quite a lot, actually, because this really dives into like paleontology and obviously natural history and genetics, and but look at these. It was really interesting talking about how we evolved from fish and just the natural history of the world and evolution. And it goes to talk about this paleontologist's experience out in the field and finding bones and doing their own research. And it goes through the evolution of different body parts. So it first talks about hands, teeth, talks about vision and ears and hearing and the body and in general. And I found it really, really interesting. There were some parts that I wanted more specificity on, but that's just because I have a bit of a background on this, and some things it mentioned, but it didn't give specific names, and I would have liked to have that. But that's, because I do have a background in science, but this would be pretty easy. I would say that this is an easy introduction for people who don't really have that type of background. This was a very easy read. And the pictures were so cute. And especially having the diagrams and the pictures makes it easier to understand and have the visualization of what they're talking about. So here's a really interesting diagram where it talks about how jawbones in like fish got turned into one of the tiny, tiny ear bones we have as humans. So we have the three smallest bones in the body are in the ear, and this talks about how that evolved from the jawbones in fish. Super cool. That's just a little taste of what it talks about, and of course talks about the research of specific genes, and super, super interesting. I highly recommend this if you're interested in natural history, genetics, all that, paleontology, all that good stuff. Usually within my monthly wrap-ups, I do some other little statistics and fun little things like my favorite song, favorite movie, show, etc. But I didn't end up writing those down for the past couple months. I don't know if I can come up with something for March, but unfortunately, I didn't write any of those down for February or January, so maybe if I think of something and I catalog back, I can come up with it and write that in my journal, but for now I don't have those little fun facts about my other favorites for the month. But I would say that my favorite book of January was... I'm not entirely sure, actually. None of them really, were peak, but I would say probably that my engagement was highest with Mistress of Lies, but I think what stuck with me more was Light from Uncommon Stars. But I don't know. I don't think I can really pick a favorite because I'd say that there were some things that I forgot about Mistress of Lies, but there was more of an impact afterwards from Light from Uncommon Stars. So do with that what you will. Getting into February, I also read 3 books here, and again with nonfiction, I started off finishing Consequences of Capitalism by Noam Chomsky and Marv Waterstone. And this is basically a transcription from their lectures in university. I don't remember which university it was that they taught at, but it was basically just their lectures, the transcripts from their lectures turned into a book. And this talks a lot about, this focuses mostly on America and the historical progress of capitalism and how it affects daily life there. And so this is something that I really would like to go back and reference again because I think it was super dense with the facts and information. So there's a lot that didn't really stick in my mind, but the overall impact definitely enraged me. It's definitely very insightful and very interesting. And I think a lot of people, like, I think people really need to read this, learn about this, and see how much it affects our daily lives because it gave a lot of statistics about, you know, the 1% and how disproportionate the money is that they get versus all of the working class, and how it really goes into talk about some of the themes from Karl Marx and what labor means and what capital means. And so I would really like to, you know, read that source material from Marx, but this gives a lot of history also about foreign policies, which I don't really have a lot of background or knowledge about, but it talked about a lot of things that the US was involved in Central and South America. And so there was a lot that I was confused about there because I don't have that sort of history background, but it definitely does open up my mind to wanting to learn about those foreign policies and all of these events that took place that just really shows how the US does not, you know, how they really like to dive into other people's business and really impose themselves where they're not necessarily welcome. So again, this really sparked the rage in me that was already there and will continue to be there until God knows when. But this was really interesting, and again, I would love to go back to this, and I definitely plan on reading more of Noam Chomsky's work because I didn't realize that he was such a big, like, political writer, because I know him mostly for his linguistics. I've learned about him within, you know, psycho-neurolinguistics classes. So it's really interesting and insightful to see how he's very big in politics and American history. The second one that I finished in February was Black Psychedelic Revolution by Dr. Nicholas Powers. And I received this as an ARC from NetGalley a couple months ago. And it came out at the end of January. And I was reading it for a while, but I didn't finish until the end of February. Literally everyone needs to read this book. I swear to God, this was so insightful, so emotional, so captivating. Another nonfiction, talking about pretty much what's in the name, about the power of psychedelics and how it has the potential to spark a revolution and how it can be used in a therapeutic context. But this book specifically talked about the Black experience and how it is people of color and people within minorities that would really, really benefit from this type of treatment. And so this talks a lot about racism and specifically internalized racism, and how the author highlights that psychedelics could help turn around internalized racism because it can help you really see the oneness of yourself and the universe, and then the place of yourself in the universe, and how you are not defined by other people's perception of you, their beliefs, their stereotypes. All of those things really kind of make you put yourself into a box, and it influences how you see yourself and how you move around in the world. And so this really highlights how the use of psychedelics could help you break out of that, and what the author terms as coming back into the body and coming back into recognizing your own individual power. And it was so beautiful, absolutely beautiful. It really highlights the importance of the setting that you're in when you would take the psychedelics, and your mindset and what it is that you want to help and want to achieve, and the trauma that you want to dissolve. And it goes on to critique the medical model and how it would be really difficult. This does have a very dark tone to it, in the sense that something like this is still very kind of far off in the future, because we know that this has been shut down before with the whole war on drugs thing, and it would be shut down again. If it were to become mainstream, it would be privatized and capitalized upon, and that is not what needs to be done, especially the fact that this is something that could most benefit those those in a minority, and those who do not have the means to buy it or be able to afford this type of treatment, especially if they can't afford regular therapy to begin with. So the medical model that it kind of hypothesizes is something that is still far away from being attainable. And so it does have a sort of bleak outlook, and it does criticize the whole idea of hope, where it would be nice to have hope, but realistically, so much needs to change in the world before something like this would become available. And the author's writing is absolutely gorgeous. The way that they seamlessly interweave their own stories and their own experiences, as well as hypothetical situations. And if this were to happen, what would it look like? And at the end, it genuinely made me cry. I thought it was very powerful, and gives you a lot of history about racism in America. And it was my I I highly recommend this. I think it is honestly a crucial piece of literature. I thank you again to NetGalley for giving this to me as an ARC, and I would love to get myself a physical copy to flip through and go over again. Finally, the last book I finished in February was Song of Blood and Stone by Elle Penelope. This is a fantasy about a woman who has powers, but she's not really educated about them, because her family is no longer around to teach her, and she ends up finding a soldier when she is on her way to town, and they kind of get caught up with one another. He is being hunted by another group of soldiers and is taken captive, and the woman is kind of forced to deal with all of these soldiers when she doesn't really want to get into their business. But this is also set in a world where there are segregated countries by a magical power and a magical like barrier called the mantle, but now that is crumbling, and so people are finally being able to cross the boundaries, and one place is ruled by a kind of tyrannical godlike king that wants to take over the other country. And then there's this thing with prophetic dreams about a previous queen, and it's a little confusing. I really wasn't as invested in this as I thought I would be. Like, it sounded interesting, but honestly, I maybe wanted to DNF, but I also wanted to wait until it got interesting. And then by the end, like with the resolution, like I got confused, and genuinely I'm not really sure where the resolution took us. Parts of it were interesting, especially with the prophetic dreams, but well, they're not really prophetic dreams. They're more like dreams about the history. I think the magic was interesting because it's something called Earth Song. I'm still not entirely sure. Like, I think it's not a very like hard magic system. It's more like it's not very defined. It's just magic that she can only use certain amounts of, otherwise it really drains her. Honestly, my attention with this was really slipping. It was really hard for me to keep going. By the end, I kind of just wanted it to be over, and I feel bad saying that, but genuinely, I think one of the main things is that the romance that ends up between the two characters was way too fast, and they end up like pining for each other, but like they become obsessed with each other. It's not really pining, because I feel like pining implies yearning, implies like something they can't have, which to an extent, when you discover more about the characters, it is like that. But mostly it was just like quick. And that really took me out of it. I really did not enjoy that at all. And this is a like 5 book series, at least 4, maybe 5 books. And so I imagined that maybe this would be something that spread over the whole of the series. This I didn't rate very high. I think it was like a 3 star, but maybe like a 2.75. I'm sorry. I don't know though if I might want to keep going in the series, because apparently the second book follows completely different characters and maybe dives into more about the history of these countries and like a different perspective. So I'm not really sure about how I feel about this book. And if I will continue, but we'll see. It's definitely not high on my priority. So I would say that my favorite book for February was very obviously Black Psychedelic Revolution. It was absolutely amazing. I will recommend this to anyone that is either interested or not even interested, because this book can teach you a lot. Okay, now March. I was a lot more free during March, a lot more chill, and so I ended up reading 6 books in March. So let's get through them. The first one was Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Jessie. That's how I heard other people pronounce her name. So Ya Jessie. This is a literary fiction about a woman who is a neuroscientist looking into the research of addiction, because her brother had an addiction. So they are a Ghanaian family. The mother moved to America when she had her firstborn, which is the main character's brother, and then the main character was born in America, and they grew up in Alabama all their lives. And eventually the brother ended up with an addiction and died, and this really affected her mother as well and made her very depressed. And this is basically a recounting of the main character's story and them growing up, and really looking at the family dynamics as well as their religion. They are a very, very Christian, devout family, but as the main character grows up, her name is Gifty. As Gifty grows up, she really starts to question that and question the religion and the use of prayers. And it's really, really deep and dark and emotional, and goes on to explore the effects of mental illness as well as grief and religion and science, and how all of these play together to sort of motivate her current studies in neuroscientist and what it is that she is trying to discover. And this was I got through this book in 2 days. It was so compulsive. It really grabbed my attention, and it was really something that I found myself relating to a lot. You know, despite our vast differences between me and the main character, I found some things very of myself really reflected, because first of all, I am studying neuroscience, which was my main attraction to this book in the first place. And so I really loved seeing all those little facts and tidbits that I know, and I love seeing like science within my books, and so that part was really fun. But as well as the religious struggle, as well as seeing how mental illness affects the family. My family, for the most part, didn't really believe in mental health, mental illness, and religious faith has always been something that I've struggled with as well growing up. And kind of going through the motions of realizing that don't really know where you fit in. And yeah, this was absolutely beautiful. I highly recommend this book. It is very dark and emotional, but I think that all of these topics were handled wonderfully, and it made for a very compelling story. The second book, another nonfiction. I feel so proud of myself for reaching these goals of reading more nonfiction. I read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Y. Davis. This is my first Davis, and I am very excited to read more from her. She is so insightful and intelligent, and I really appreciated the things that I learned from this book. Again, these sort of reference books are something that I want to go back to and sort of reference these facts and information more than once. I think the topics that were mentioned throughout this were really interesting. Despite this being a very, very short book, this talks a lot about the gendered differences between prisons and how men or women criminals are seen differently and treated differently, and how women more often than men are obviously subjugated to sexual assault to incredible degrees. This really highlights the prison industrial complex, and it talks a lot about the history of slavery and how prisons were put into place to still uphold slavery through loopholes and exploitation and the eventual prison industrial complex. And it was really insightful seeing about how many prisons were built over such a short amount of time, and how it really became a booming business because obviously they got privatized, they got capitalized upon and exploited, and are just being filled up because of that privatization, even if it takes innocent people off the streets, and especially how it targets people of color. This has always been something that I've been passionate about, always been something I'm interested in, and this is another example of another book that just reignites my rage and my passion for reform, and also a bleak despair because of how high the powers are that would need to be dismantled in order to get rid of such injustices. But this does mention kind of alternatives from an abolitionist perspective, and what it is that we need to focus on in order to kind of, gain more justice. And that is to focus on mental health, to focus on schools being the number one focus, and how there needs to be a demilitarization of schools, because I don't live in America. And so it kind of came as a cultural shock to me that there are schools that are completely surrounded by security guards and metal detectors, and that sometimes like police or police dogs would come into schools and sort of target specific students. Sometimes I would see that on TV, and I didn't fully understand the extent of that being realistic portrayal. And it's just heartbreaking to see how that is the result of school shootings, and also the result of racism. But schools should be a safe place. They really should. And schools should focus on educating their students in multiple different facets of life. And it's just heartbreaking to see how that isn't always the priority, and especially now that we're seeing all of this legislation coming up that really aims to dismantle the history that is being taught in that country. Uh, Anyways, so the sort of alternatives really focus on community and really upholding and uplifting your community, and how important that is in order to create a safe environment, and an environment that that doesn't target specific people, specific minorities, and exploit them. Good morning. It is now the next day because filming got interrupted yesterday, but here we are. Where were we? The third book that I finished in March was Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is the second book in the Wayward Children series. It is a novella series following children who go through portals to either ideal worlds or not so ideal worlds. And they stay there for an indefinite amount of time, up until they find the portal to go back to their home, and they are forever changed. In the first book, it follows, it is set within a school which is meant to help those kids kind of readjust or at least find the community of other kids that this has happened to. And in the and there was a murder mystery in the first book. And in the second one, it follows two characters that I really, really liked from the first one. So I was excited about this one. And it's these twins, Jack and Jill, and they end up in the moors. And one of the girls ends up with a kind of like vampire king who is the master of the moors, and the other one ends up with a mad scientist. And then there also is another murder, actually. So this talks about like their childhood and how they grew up. One of them super, super girly, and the other one super tomboy, because their parents wanted them to be very different and distinct. But they didn't, ask what the kids wanted. And so they grew up to really kind of hate their parents and never really know what they want or even saying what they want. And so this being dropped into this fantasy world kind of gave them a new ability to discover things that they want. You really get to see how their personalities change. I think that we get a lot more of a focus on Jack rather than Jill. And I really like Jack. She was the one that ended up with the mad scientist, and she was the one that was super, super girly. But then she ends up kind of on the opposite track. And then Jillian was the one that was a tomboy. And then she ends up kind of swerving and becoming more girly and becoming the sort of daughter of the vampire king. I found it pretty entertaining. It had a lot to say about the nature of relationships between the siblings, and I find it I found it kind of sad to see how they really separated, and kind of in the first place they weren't ever really that close to begin with, because they never really were allowed to do the same things, and so they were never really close. But even within this, we see them grow farther and farther apart, but at the same time the bond is still there. They're still going to be sisters no matter what. And so this definitely did have a lot to say about the parents' role and how you should still ask about what your kid wants and not just impose things upon them for your own gain or your own appearance. I like the world and the atmosphere of the world, where they thought they were coming to this really fun new world, but it turned out to be a lot more dangerous than they thought. And I kind of do wish we got a little bit more of the discovery into that danger and the sort of different creatures that were lurking around in that world, because they did mention like werewolves. So that was interesting, but we only really get those two girls' main perspectives, and they don't really go out much. They're not really allowed to. We just see how Jack gets more experience learning how to do more things and help the mad scientist with his tasks. And we see Jillian become really desperate for the vampire king's attention, and it's kind of twisted in the sense that both of these sort of paternal fathers say that they love the kids, and I feel like there's a really thin line between that love being like as a paternal figure versus something a bit farther. I feel like I was questioning that constantly. I'm not really sure where they intended to fall on that line. It genuinely wasn't really that explicit to me, but I would say, at least for the mad scientist, actually, no, I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know, because by the end of this book, they are like 17 years old. And so they stay there for like 5 years, and genuinely couldn't tell you if this was the love that they claimed to show the girls was meant to be paternal or more. So I don't know. Regardless, I am very interested in going on to the next book because it relates to a different character that I really liked within the first book. So hopefully I'll get to that soon as well. So the last week of March was the Trans Rights Readathon, and this went on from the 21st of March until the 31st. but I didn't know about it until like the 24th. But I still did want to pick up more books that showed trans representation, either in the characters or from the author. And so I did pick up a couple really short ones. The first one I picked up was Feed Them Silence by Lee Mandello. And this is about a middle aged neuroscientist, another neuroscientist read in this month. And this is set in the not distant, the near future, so 2031, I believe, where she is able to create a neural link to a wolf that she is studying that is endangered. And basically she's able to gain the full sensory experience of the wolf, and she's claiming to study them in order to get to know their patterns and their behaviors, because they are endangered. And I'm not really sure what they intended to do with that information and how that was supposed to help them. Didn't really dive into that, but the main focus of the story, honestly, is the main character's failing marriage. She is a lesbian, and she's been with her partner for many, many years, but she isn't really giving her the attention that she needs. Isn't really caring about her own work because I believe she was an anthropologist or a teacher. On the wife's side, she didn't really agree with the work that the main character was doing. She found that it wasn't really a consensual agreement to be able to surgically implant something within the wolf and then, kind of enter its body without it knowing. She didn't agree with that part. And so throughout the book, we see the main character slowly kind of spiral into obsession, and she constantly wants to be within that neural interface, but she has restrictions because it's professional work that she's doing. And so there's very strict parameters of when she can join the interface, and we see her constantly obsessing over it and wanting to be there because she's very lonely. She doesn't feel like she has her own like friends, and especially seeing like her wife kind of slip away from her, she becomes obsessed with this feeling of being within the wolf pack and having that sort of companionship. So it is pretty sad on that sense, but genuinely, I don't think I really liked this book very much. I think it was just like, it was okay. Like, the characters aren't really likable. The main focus is the failing marriage, and there's not too much of a resolution. And then eventually, the research doesn't really go where she wants it to go. And so I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting from this book, but I would say that this book is genuinely the love child of Our Wives Under the Sea and The Call of the Wild. That Feed Them Silence is literally just the love child between them. We get the failing marriage and not really any resolution from this book. And then we get the experience of the wolf from this book, except I think both of these maybe had a bit better or maybe more poetic writing. There were some like quotes from this book that I appreciated, but first of all, I didn't like this book. Unpopular opinion, but I didn't like this book. This one is like one of the only classics I've read, so this pleasantly surprised me actually. I really like this. I don't know, maybe I would have liked the book better if it showed a bit more of like how the character would have changed for the better. But things didn't happen that way. There were obstacles, and it was just all right. So the next book I finished wasn't for the trans rights readathon. It was just something that I've been in the middle of for months. But the last book I finished was for the trans rights readathon. But I'm going in order. So the fifth book I finished in March, finally, was The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu. And if you don't know, this is the second book in the Three Body Problem series. The series is called Remembrance of Earth's Past. If you haven't watched my previous videos, I have videos and I think a vlog where I talk a lot about this, and because this really like shook my world. This took me by surprise and I loved it. I didn't have anything to expect from it. I'd heard of it before, but then the trailer for the show came out and it looked really, really good. And I was like, okay, I need to read this. Unfortunately, I never finished the show, but I do still want to get back to it because apparently it kind of starts to go, the last episode starts to go into the second book, which for what reason, I don't know. But so I obviously wanted to make sure that I read this before finishing the show. So this this was genuinely a lot harder to get into because it kind of follows a completely different cast of characters. And so a lot of it felt random at first and very mundane, and you're not really sure about why these characters are important, like what's the point. For me it was really really slow to get into because it felt so different from this book. And I've heard other people mention about how these are two different translators, and that could possibly be the reason why the writing for this seems a bit different than this one. But for the most part I think it did get better, and boy does it surprise you. Holy shit. Holy shit. I don't even know like where to start or like what to mention because it really kicks off and it gets really intense. And it's kind of interesting the way that he writes because his pacing is not what you would necessarily expect. Sometimes he literally just like writes a sentence or a small paragraph about a huge event. And you're like, wait a minute, what? That's it? Where's what? Like, I'm sorry. What? And and so it's really jarring. It really gives you whiplash. And I kind of appreciate that in the sense that it really makes the plot twists a lot more like sharp rather than having such a gradual build up to that sentence. Like obviously we do see the exposition before and we see like why that might have happened. Kind of. But we don't always get the explicit, explanation from the characters and their thoughts. But eventually, finding out about how important these characters are and what their role is by the end of this book and how everything has changed so fundamentally was crazy. Like, I'm actually getting goosebumps thinking about how dark this gets. It's called the Dark Forest for a reason. Keep this in mind. It gets dark by the end, and again, whiplash. I'm kind of like speechless thinking and talking about this in a sense where it's like, I don't know what else I can say about this, but I fucking loved it. I loved it, and I cannot wait to read the next book. But I'm so curious about what it's gonna follow because I had a whole scenario. I had a whole, like, I was imagining that we were gonna follow this one character when I was like about this far through. Like, I had this much left. I thought we were going to follow a specific character and where their actions and consequences would take them. But then all of that got derailed really quickly. And so now I'm just genuinely like, where is the next book going to take us? Um, and I'm excited for the next book also because it is again translated by Ken Liu, who translated this one. And I like that he put a lot more footnotes into this one that explained a lot more terms and history and stuff. And he put chapters. This one does not have chapters. This one is only really separated by chapters by the time skips that happen, but this one has a lot more like chapters that breaks them up, which I found a lot more easier to get through. So hopefully the next one will have chapters. But anyways, I loved this. It was insane. I would definitely love to reread this series sometimes in the future because then you'd really pick up on things and connect about who these characters are and what happened. So finally, the last book I finished in March was Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester. And this I read again for the Trans Rights Readathon. This is part autobiography, part just nonfiction, talking about how trans issues are represented within the media and how harmful it can be. And this goes on to talk about a lot of different topics relating to gender and sex and how we define those two, as well as looking at how the research has progressed throughout the years and how obviously there is history of trans people further than where we think that it starts. Like, trans people have always existed, though the way that things have been documented maybe isn't always the same, or maybe has been destroyed. Like within the 30s and the 40s, there was a specific doctor whose research was specifically targeted because he worked on trans research. And during the whole Nazi Holocaust, he was one of the main people that was targeted, and his books were burned, and a lot of the things that he documented, all got burned. And so it talks a bit about that history and how trans people have been portrayed. Like, they mentioned the movie The Danish Girl and how it was supposed to be like a biopic about a real person, and how the portrayal in the movie was very different than how her history was in real life. And it obviously talks about different news media and outlets and the titles that are given to news relating to trans people, and how a lot of times their words are misconstrued, and then the stories themselves are kind of not accurate. They don't always actually go on to accurately transcribe or report upon what the trans people themselves are actually saying, or what their input in the situation. And a lot of it is just assuming things about them. And of course, this goes on to talk about certain struggles within mental health and gender dysphoria. And it was really interesting and really insightful, especially how the author goes to talk about their own experience, especially the highlight about how trans can be defined in so many different ways. And how it is very much like an umbrella term and includes gender nonconforming, so people who are genderqueer or non-binary, and it is very much like an umbrella term. And then it can also obviously include male to female, transgender, and etc. But for the most part, it is something that is kind of hard to be defined, because every person has their own individual experience of how they experience their own gender, because all of it is influenced by their own culture, their own experience, their own sexuality as well. And of course they talk about mental health and how the suicide rates are astronomically high for trans people compared to other populations. And so it was heartbreaking learning a lot about these specific statistics and how we're so targeted. And it's just like, why not just let the people exist? It's really frustrating. As a sort of reminder, in case maybe you are new here or you don't know, didn't see, I myself am non-binary. I go by they, them pronouns. And so this was really insightful for me to hear, again, another perspective of how another person who uses those pronouns and is gender nonconforming, how their experience within trying to explore the binary or the non-binary is, and how that has impacted their life and how they have felt throughout growing up, and the gender dysphoria that they experienced as they were figuring that out about themselves. So I really connected a lot with parts of that. And I would definitely love to learn more about transgender history, of course. I think it is, well, it is. It is absolutely fundamental within the history of queer people. You can't have the queer liberation that we see now, even though we are far from liberated. You can't have that without the transgender people, and especially the people of color that really put their lives on the line for the liberation. My favorite book that I read in March was definitely The Dark Forest. This blew my mind. So that is all that I read within the first quarter of the year. Let me know what you read and what you plan on reading for the next quarter. I will have my April TBR coming up really soon, and I'm really excited about that because we are going back to Aurelium. It is the Magical Readathon once again. I hope you stick around to see that soon, and if you want to like this video, if you like it, subscribe if you would like to hear more about me rambling about books. And if you want to let me know that you were here, you can leave a tree emoji for the dark forest or any space emoji. Space or trees. Thank you so much for being with me and supporting me, and I hope you have an amazing day. Happy reading. Bye.